Hi, so in this video, basically we are talking about the economic applications of partial derivatives, particularly in the case of the demand and supply. Okay, so and particularly not in terms of supply, basically in terms of your demand particularly. Okay, and maybe you can talk about in supply functions, but we are taking the case of the demand functions here. So we have this topic as basically your economic applications. Economic applications. So we have the topic as the topic is basically economic applications of partial derivatives. Okay, so basically consider two related commodities X and Y with the following demand functions. X1 is a function of P1 and P2 and X2 is a function of P1 and P2. That means X1 is the quantity demanded of good 1 and X2 is the quantity demanded for good 2 and such that your X1 is a function of P1 and P2 and X2 is also a function of your P1 and your P2. Okay, so basically what we have to say here. So my del x1 by del p1 is basically what? That means if my x1 is a function of my p1 and p2, so if basically my p1 changes, how is basically my x1 changes? Okay, keeping the change in p2 constant. So x1 in a sense is going to change when your p1 and p2 both changes. But when the moment I'm talking about del x1 by del p1, okay, because when you talk about change, you have to keep the things, other things constant. Okay, so that means you're keeping the change in p2 to be constant. Okay, so del x1 by del p1 shows basically if my prices changes by 1 unit, how is my quantity demanded going to change? Okay, so similarly your del x2 by del p2 basically shows you that if my price of good 2 is going to change, how is quantity demanded of good 2 going to change? Okay, so the first thing which you have to remember that your del x1 by del p1 and del x2 by del p2 is always negative less than 0 because it represents what? It represents your, in a sense, it represents your demand law. Okay, okay. But when I talk about the sign of del x1 del p2 or del x2 del p1, this sign is not necessarily negative. It depends upon the nature of two commodities. Upon the nature of two commodities. Okay. So what is the intuition behind it? So what do I mean by the nature of basically my two commodities? So nature of two commodities. So please elaborate nature of two commodities. So commodities can in a sense be basically your competitive or substitute using the same term interchangeably, or the goods can be complementary. Okay, so what basically I can infer from this particular logic? So if my del x1 by del p2 and del x2 by del p1 is greater than 0, strictly greater than 0, we said that the two goods are competitive or they are substitutes. That means if my price of good 2 changes, if my price of good 2 changes, the quantity demanded of good 1 increases. That means we have the case of substitutes. That means substitutes means like your tea and coffee. So if the price of coffee increases, the quantity demanded of tea increases. Okay. So this way it has to be strictly greater than 0. But when I talk about complementary goods, that means basically car and petrol. Okay. So del x1 del p2 and del x2 by del p1 is less than 0. The goods are said to be complementary. Okay, that means that the price of petrol rises, the demand for cars falls. Okay, so in a nutshell, I could say that if the cross change is greater than 0, we have the case of substitutes. If the cross change is less than 0, we have the case of complementary goods. Okay. Now, then we have the concept of your direct and cross partial elasticities of demand. So when I talk about this expression as basically my first good with respect to its own prices, first prices. So if this basically term is basically for your elasticity. So this is basically representing, the moment I'm writing 1, 1, 2, 2, that is basically representing your direct elasticity. So your N11 is basically minus P1 x1 del x1 del P1 greater than 0. If suppose this is greater than 0 and your N22, okay, minus P2 x2 del x2 del P2 is greater than, suppose me, it's always greater than 0. Now why it's always greater than 0? Because this expression and this expression, these two expression in a sense represents what? These two expression in a sense represents your demand law. Since it is representing your demand law, and so logically they have to be negative. But the moment I talk about this expression, maybe I can talk about this particular thing, and this particular thing, it has a negative sign here and it has a negative sign here. So this is also negative. And negative into negative makes positive. So that means your direct elasticity is always going to be greater than 0. Okay. So the moment I'm writing this thing or this thing or this thing or this thing, this is always going to be strictly greater than 0. Okay. Fine. Now what about this expression, which is and this expression? See what I did in the earlier case when I talk about elasticity is responsiveness. So when I talk about the elasticity of y with respect to x, we have y by x. Then we have your basically your suppose we have talked about you are given with any particular function. So when you talk about the elasticity, so if you're talking about the elasticity of the function, so it can be represented by your this form dy by dx, function of one variables, or basically this form. Okay, so just like what we studied in MME1, this elasticity is just basically a reformulation of this thing. So instead of D, we are in a sense going to use del. It's just again representing your this thing. So the moment I'm writing basically N12, this is equals to this thing, and N21, this is basically equals to this thing. Okay, we have a negative sign here, we have a negative sign here, and we have this thing and this thing. Now, if I particularly look, basically, it is basically a cross elasticity. Cross elasticity. Now, if I talk about the cross elasticity particularly, this cross elasticity can have either of the sign depending upon this case and this case. So that means del x1 by del p2. Logically, it can have a positive sign or it can have a negative sign depending upon the case that the goods are competitive, substitutes and complementary. Okay, so if this is basically greater than 0, I say that the goods are competitive. And if this is less than 0, we say that the goods are complementary. Okay, so this is basically the competitive and this is basically the complementary case, right? So depending upon this, we have a minus sign here and a minus sign here, and this basically sign can be either be positive or it can be negative. Positive and it can be negative depending upon the case, right? So I would say that what conclusion I can draw here, that your cross elasticity can be positive, can be negative, depending upon the goods we are talking about, whether we are talking about substitutes or we are talking about the complementary goods. This is basically your nutshell. Okay. Now, so we'll do this few questions which are giving as a homework. So this is basically your demand function is this thing. This is question number 1. Question number 2 is your x1. Okay. Question number 3 okay. Okay, so this alpha to beta basically is basically a constant, and in fact mu is also a constant. Okay, and it is given that your alpha 1, alpha 2, beta, gamma, mu is basically greater than 0. So you have 3 questions which you are going to do for this particular topic, and you are going to check basically that for each of the following you have to find out the you have to find out the partial elasticity of demand, and second you have to test whether goods are complementary or competitive, whatever is the case. So I'll do question number 1. So your x1 is equals to 2p1 minus 2p2q. What is my del x1 by del p1? p1. Okay. This is obviously negative because of the demand law. This is okay. p2, 3 minus 1. This is basically del x1 by del p2. This is basically coming out to be what? Greater than 0. And if this is basically greater than 0, I say that the goods are what? You're my competitive. Okay. Now, what about basically my x2 is given to be? If I try to find out this thing, it has to be negative. If I try to find out this thing, this is basically what? Del x2 by del p1. So this is basically a 2. Okay. p1, 2 minus 1, p2 minus 3. greater than 0. Why? Because the prices basically cannot be negative. So I would say that the goods are what? These the goods are substitutes. Okay. Now after this, when we are going to find out the elasticity, so if I try to find out the elasticity, so let's find out N11, sorry, N11. So this is basically minus of P1 by N11 X1 del X1 by del P1. My del X1 by del P1 was coming out to be minus 4. So again, so this is into del X1 by del P1. My del X1 by del P1 was coming out to be 2 into minus 2 P1 minus 3 P2 3. This is coming out to be less than 0. We have a negative sign here. So this is in a sense coming out to be greater than 0. Similarly, N22 will also come out to be greater than 0. Now when I talk about this expression N12, this is basically what? This part into del X2 by del P2 and del X2 by del P2. So del X1 by del P2. This is basically coming out to be what? This is coming out to be greater than 0. This is basically, this expression is positive and you have a negative. So that means it's basically less than 0. Okay. So we have shown that it's coming out to positive. So one thing we can say that it's basically competitive or substitute case. Rest questions you can do on your own.